very end, at the very end, the recording will stop, but the people that are on are still going to be able to hear. We can't sort of cut that out. So I routinely make the mistake of saying, you know, bursting into song and saying, oh, that was great, or what did you mean by that? So just to be conscious, because Jana always reminds me, but I am now reminding myself. So. We will be beginning in about a minute or two. We want to give people a chance to come in. We realize it's different time zones for people all over the world. And just to check, Jen, I pressed the wrong button. I reclaimed host, so make sure that you're host if you could. Thank you. Let me begin with a few introductory remarks before we get going into the actual webinar itself. This is the second of a series of 5 webinars on advancing international pediatric clinical research. And today we're going to be talking about hearing from young people in clinical research, a time to listen. My name is Barbara Beerer. I am a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and the faculty director of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center. It's really my pleasure to welcome you, and I look forward to this conversation. I'm really excited about the discussion that will follow. Could I have the next slide, please? Just wanted to say that the MRCT Center, for those who do not know, is a research and policy center at Harvard and the Brigham, where we're really dedicated to improving the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials, international, multinational clinical trials, with a focus on really making clinical trials and clinical research better for the participant and improving the outcome of those trials. We do the work by engaging diverse stakeholders, industry, from CROs, academia, patient advocates, and in this case, young people, regulatory individuals, ethics committees, to really think through emerging issues in global clinical trials not to define those issues uniquely, but rather to really find approaches and solutions that are ethical, actionable, and practical. And we believe that if we have everyone around the table, that we will really find an approach that works for all, or at least that we can start, adapt, and adopt for all. We took on the problem of pediatric global clinical trials. Could I have the next slide, please? Really because children deserve access to safe and effective medicines, but they have been historically excluded from or underrepresented in research. And in the absence of data for safety, efficacy, and effectiveness, then really prescribing drugs or products to children, every child becomes their own experiment. The situation is further complicated by the fact that pediatric diseases and conditions are really generally rare, and therefore to sponsor and conduct a clinical trial requires often multi-site research and often multinational research. And there are persistent clinical and ethical issues which governing ethical principles must be agreed upon, the difference in interpretation and application, and different regulatory frameworks for different countries. We've heard of significant operational challenges in trial initiation and conduct. And what has become really clear over the last 2 or 3 years when we've been doing this work is that the pediatric voice is, and often the family voice, the parent, guardian, or caregiver, is not routinely solicited nor included in the research life cycle. And I mean this not as a participant, but rather we don't hear from young people about the sort of planning of research, what questions are important, how they think about their experience, etc. Children are not routinely offered a seat at the table. Could I have the next slide, please? So when we started this project some time ago, we did it with diverse leadership, a member of the EMA, European Medicines Association, somebody from industry, academia. We had parents represented, and then about 80 members from all stakeholder groups with geographic diversity. And we sort of outlined what we were going to talk about, which is to review the current landscape of pediatric research governance, thinking about the differing or non-harmonized legislative, regulatory, and guidance gaps and inconsistencies, to think about current initiatives to improve pediatric research globally beyond ours so that we could really complement the work that was being done. Think about challenges relating to decision-making by and on behalf of children, and we're going to be talking about that further. And then thinking about the benefit-risk considerations that create barriers and inefficiencies in transnational research in children. And as I said, thinking about meaningful ways to engage patients, families, community members, and the individuals who represent them. Could I have the next slide? So this is the second of a series of webinars that we're hosting. It's funded in part through a US FDA Science Conference grant. We're having 5 virtual webinars. Each of them are repeated twice, once at least in the East Coast in the US in the morning, and once in the evening, so that we can really invite a global audience to participate with us. So it is our evening here. It's early morning in India. It's midday or so, I think, in Asia, and early evening in the West Coast and South America and Canada. So, so thank you all for being here. And thank you, 11 a.m. in Australia. So as you can see, we're working hard to find the commonality of spirit in addressing pediatric research. And the topics are the same, but the audience is different and the speakers are different. Could I have the next slide, please? So the last one we did, the first one was informing the future from COVID-19 lessons learned. The recording for that is on the website, and we invite you to listen to it. Today, we're talking about, as I said, hearing from young people. In June, we'll be talking about decision-making at the level of the Ethics Committee and E11. And then in the fall, talking about regulatory convergence to facilitate international cooperation. And there will be one other in 2023, which we'll decide at the time or closer to the time. Instead of spending a lot of time today reviewing people's extensive, really impressive biographies and history in this work, we've put together a bio book that's on the website and that we invite you to look at to save the time of introductions. So with that, let me ask you to play the first video. This is an introductory video. We were very conscious that we wanted to hear from children and young people about research, but we did not want to disturb their lives unnecessarily or inconveniently. And therefore, ICANN, the International Children's Advisory Network, worked with us to put together this really very compelling short video. Thank you.
My name is Megan. I'm 11 years old and I am from the United States of America.
My name is Vicky Edith. I'm 20 years old. I'm from Uganda.
So hi, I'm Nora. I'm 18 years old and I'm from Barcelona, Spain.
My name is Wycliffe. I'm 16. I'm from Uganda.
Have you been involved in medical care and healthcare?
Yeah, I think I've pretty much been involved in medicine and healthcare since I was little.
Yes, I have.
Yes.
Yes, I'm a patient, but also a young advisor at San Juan de Déu Children's Hospital, and currently I am in my first year of the biomedicine degree.
Tell us something about your experiences receiving medical care and healthcare.
I think my experience with medicine's been good. My doctors have explained to me what kind of medicines I'm taking, how I need to take them, and so on. I know what changes could be made to the meds and what they could mean. I know that there have been several times where I've been really interested in learning more about medicine, so I would look into things, and then when I'd go to the doctor's office, I would talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, and then maybe the doctors would argue with me, and then I'd argue back and they'd say I should be a lawyer when I grow up.
During my vacation of senior 6, I went to a certain clinic and helped the nurse with cleaning people's wounds and taking their temperatures.
I wish my doctor should understand that I want clinical research. Decision makers should know the effects involved in clinical trials.
So I was diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy at 18 months old, so I started listening medic words since I was so little, because in my hospital, San Juan de Déu, doctors try to make us understand as better as possible our disease and our condition. For the young people that we born with a congenital disease, medicine, healthcare, doctors, treatment, side effects are familiar words. And the hospital is our second house. Like every year I can have an average of 1 per month visits at hospital. So
Have you been involved in clinical trials or research of any kind?
I've already been a part of a clinical trial before, sort of. When I was very young, I was placed into an ongoing clinical trial that wasn't in a research center, and I didn't know about it. I think I was around maybe 2 years old. And if I did know about it, I don't remember, of course, because I was 2 years old. And no harm was done or anything, and I trust that the clinical trial was used to the benefit of others. I don't really know what it was for, something about kidney function, I think. I don't really know much about it, but I hope that it was used to the benefit of others.
Yes, researchers should know that young people need proper handling and care.
Yes, I have. I wish my doctors could have asked me whether I wanted to become one of the medical researchers. For young people, there need to be clear collection of information from the patient in order to get clear information from the patient.
So I'm so lucky to be in one nowadays, and it is a very beautiful and rewarding experience for me. I'm participating in this clinical trial from 5 years ago now, I think. In my personal experience, I didn't feel that my doctors were missing something to ask me. They all have care about everything that happens to me, and not only about the disease, they have care about our mental health, which is something I'm so grateful for, because sometimes we forget this part of a disease. It is probably one of the most important red flags in a life of a person who have a disease like mine, a person who will have the disease forever.
Why do you think researchers should ask kids about clinical trials?
I think it's important to know that people, and well, all people, but especially young people, when they walk into the place where they're going to do the clinical trial, they don't know all the facts. They probably didn't just Google it and say, hey, what's going to happen to me, and then read the whole Wikipedia page about it. I think that it's very important for young people like me to share their ideas because we want to know. And I think that one of the most important ways to stand up for the world is to stand up for yourself first.
I think researchers should ask kids whether they are involved in becoming medical researchers too.
I think researchers should ask kids about clinical trials in order to get clear information.
In my opinion, I think that they should ask groups like kids or patients, organizations, because we are children, we have an opinion. We can help researchers to really perform patient-centric projects. The only way to do it is involving us as partners of their projects. And our motto is nothing for the patients without the patient.
Thank you so much. I find hearing the voices of these individuals really compelling and really instructive. It really teaches us what we need to hear. I have to say these are incredibly well-spoken, thoughtful, and important voices. We're now going to pivot to our keynote, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speakers. Dr. Sandhya Kanaka Yatiyarajula from the George Institute of Global Health, India, and a youth guest speaker, Rohit, who will be joining in the discussion today. Sandhya?
Thank you so much, Barbara, for having me over. And I'd like to first extend my congratulations to the MRCT Center for organizing this very important webinar. And before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge Rohit and his contribution and the contribution of many other young people like him who are part of our project. They're an integral part of it. And they form what we call the Adolescent Expert Advisory Group, or the AEAG in short. Can I have the next slide, please? So the project that I'm going to be talking about, it's a cluster randomized controlled trial. It is not a clinical trial, and it is called Artemis. And in my talk, while I'll be integrating our experiences and learnings from working with adolescents in the Artemis, I will also flag certain ethical issues which I feel are critical when we are doing research with children. Can I have the next slide, please? So Barbara referred to this in her talk, but I'd like to reiterate that prior to 1988, much of the research that was done on children was kind of adult-centric, in the sense that researchers did not talk so much to children, and data related to children was collected by talking to their parents or guardians or an adult close to them. And the child was kind of treated as a passive participant. So these kind of research studies, while they did have their importance, they failed to take into consideration the child's ability to contribute. So they did not see the child as an active participant. Can I have the next slide, please? Then there was a shift. So with the passing of the UN Convention on the Rights of Children in 1988, that was a kind of a landmark, and there was a paradigm shift. And researchers started recognizing children as social actors. And they began realizing that if you want to find out about children or you want to research about children, you should really be starting to talk to children. Ask the children what they feel, ask them about their experiences. And this got a further boost when the World Medical Association in 1989 recognized that it was critical for researchers to seek consent, not just from parents, but also to seek consent from the children and young people themselves. And children now began to be recognized as social actors. They began to be recognized as individuals who were able to think. They had the ability and the competencies to take judgments. And this was a very important move for all of us across the globe as researchers. Can I have the next slide, please? So now I'm going to talk about Artemis, the project I just mentioned about. And this is an acronym for Adolescent Resilience and Treatment Needs for Mental Health in Indian Slums. As I mentioned earlier, it's a cluster randomized controlled trial. It is running in 2 cities in India. One is in New Delhi, and the other is a city in South India, which is called Vijayawada. We are covering approximately 70,000 adolescents through our project. And the aim really is to test whether a community-based anti-stigma campaign leads to significant improvements in the community's behavior towards adolescents who are at high risk for stress, depression, or increased risk for self-harm and suicide. Can I have the next slide, please? So what we've done in Artemis is that because this is a cluster randomized controlled trial where the main people who we are studying are adolescents, we very, very consciously incorporated the ethical aspects of working with adolescents. So we've set up the AEAG. As I said, this is called the Adolescent Expert Advisory Group. And this we feel is a very critical element of the entire trial that we are doing. What we've done is that we have set up this as an advisory group because we feel that adolescents are the most competent people to tell us about how an anti-stigma campaign that is meant for them should be designed. Like, what should we be doing and what should we not be doing? And this entire anti-stigma campaign that we have in the Artemis has been guided by the AEAG. In fact, all the components of it have been suggested by the AEAG. So we've got things like, street plays. The plot for the street plays was written by the children themselves, and the posters that we created, so they drew it, and then we just modified it and beautified it. So in short, what the AEAG actually has been doing is that it's been suggesting contextually relevant modalities of delivering the anti-stigma campaign so that it is most relevant for those adolescents living in slums. By the way, I should mention that the Artemis is being run in slums. So there are 30 slums across both the cities, and it is focused on the children living in those slums. The AEAG members are also children who come from the same slums, and we have a range. So we cover adolescents from 10 years to 19 years. And because we also recognize that, Barbara, you were talking about cultural differences and the need to respect them. So we recognize that children who are the younger adolescents, so 10 to 14, will have significantly different concerns when compared to older adolescents. So we formed groups, 2 or 3 groups in each city. One is with these younger adolescents, and it's a mixed group of girls and boys. It's 10 to 14. And then we have the second group, which is 15 to 19. Now here what we've done is that we've actually segregated them by gender, because India is a little conservative and there might be some things which girls would not be comfortable discussing among boys. Or in Vijayawada, for example, even the participation of girls is kind of constrained when there are boys around. So we consciously took this decision of having sex segregated groups for the older adolescents. Can I move to the next slide, please? So as I mentioned, the methods, we formed these adolescent expert advisory groups. They helped us to craft the anti-stigma campaign. I've already mentioned there've been 3 in these cities. And what we really did is, before formed the adolescent expert advisory group, we had a series of what we call the pre-Aag meetings. And that was a time when COVID has already struck. So a lot of these meetings were online. Some of them were hybrid. And we did several activities with these adolescents to try and understand, how interested they were in the whole project that we were proposing, what was the quality of their participation, whether they were able to give us the time or not. And based on all of these factors, we finally selected the adolescents who would constitute the adolescent expert advisory group. Written consent was obtained from all the adolescents, and we also had consent from their parents if the adolescent was under 18, which is the legal age for us in India. Then we held fortnightly meetings. So the AAG was constituted to help us input into the campaign, but we want them to be with us throughout the duration of the project. So we have regular meetings with them every fortnight. And the very first meeting that we had was a meeting where we told them that we consider you all to be the experts, because it is a campaign for you. It is a campaign that you need to decide how it should run. And we are just there as a supporting, in a supporting role to help you out, visualize as well as roll out the campaign. So can we please move to the next slide? So these are the pictures which we have. So, this is the kind of meeting that we have with the adolescents in slums. What are the results of having this engagement with adolescents? So the AAG discussions yielded a lot of rich suggestions for us. And they suggested that when we run this anti-stigma campaign, we should have a mix of 2 strategies. One strategy should really be about awareness raising, because there is a lack of information on mental health, especially in our setting. So, mental health is stigmatized, it's not talked about, and there's very little knowledge, not just in the adolescents, but in the adults around them. So they felt that that is important. People should know what is mental health, what is, a mental disorder. So that was awareness raising. And they also felt that there should be sensitization, because if you're not able to, touch that emotional chord in your audience, they will not be able to connect to somebody who's suffering from a mental disorder. In India, it's very common, to make fun of people who are suffering from a mental disorder, even if it is a common thing like depression and anxiety. And everyone thinks that anyone with a mental disorder should be in an asylum. So they felt that it's important, to sensitize people so that they are able to feel some of the struggle and some of the problems that children with mental disorders or illnesses are facing. So we created all these materials, and we actually ran it in the formative research in 2 formative sites, one in Delhi and one in Vijayawada. And the findings have shown us that it was very well received. The anti-stigma campaign was very well received, not just by the adolescents, but also by the adults in the community. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is Rohit, and I'll just let him speak.
मेरा नाम रोहित है। मैं अपने परिवार के साथ सुल्तानपुरी में रहता हूँ। इस समय मैं 11वीं कक्षा में विद्यार्थी हूँ। एजी का सदस्य बनने के बाद मुझे जीवन के बहुत से महत्वपूर्ण तथ्यों की जानकारी हुई। एजी से जुड़ने से पहले मुझे मेंटल हेल्थ की कोई भी जानकारी नहीं थी। इसमें मैं अपना पर्सनल एक्सपीरियंस कहूँ तो मैं एक क्लासिकल डांसर हूँ, लेकिन जब मैंने इस डांस की शुरुआत करी तो काफ़ी लोगों ने मेरा मजाक उड़ाना शुरू कर दिया, जैसे ये तो घुंघरू पहन के नाचता है, ये लड़कियों का डांस है। उस समय मैं कुछ समझ नहीं पा रहा था कि मैं क्या करूं। मैं स्ट्रेस में जाने लगा, मैं धीरे धीरे डिप्रेशन में रहने लगा। एजी से जुड़ने के बाद मुझे डिप्रेशन के बारे में पता चला कि डिप्रेशन क्या है। इसमें मेरे को जेंडर के बारे में भी पता चला कि जरूरी नहीं कोई भी काम किसी एक लड़का या लड़की के लिए हो। डांस हर कोई कर सकता है, बस इंटरेस्ट होना चाहिए। एजी से जुड़ने के बाद मुझे कॉन्फिडेंस मिला, अब मैं अपना टैलेंट बाहर दिखा सकता हूँ। काफ़ी अच्छा लगता है जब एजी के द्वारा जॉर्ज इंस्टीट्यूट जैसे कार्यक्रमों में मेरे विचारों को सम्मिलित किया जाता है और महत्व दिया जाता है। जब मेरे विचारों को प्रोजेक्ट में शामिल कर लिया जाता है तो काफ़ी अच्छा लगता है। जैसे मेरे और मेरे दोस्त ने मिलकर एक कहानी पर चर्चा करी और जॉर्ज इंस्टीट्यूट में दिखाया। जॉर्ज इंस्टीट्यूट ने उस कहानी को अपने प्रोजेक्ट में शामिल करा और एक बहुत ही शानदार नाटक का निर्माण करा। जब उस नाटक को लोगों के बीच में प्रस्तुत किया गया तो लोगों को काफ़ी हद तक वो नाटक पसंद आया। जो एजी एक अच्छा माध्यम है समान युवाओं को महत्व देने के लिए। एजी जैसा ग्रुप बिल्कुल होना चाहिए, क्योंकि जब एक कार्यक्रम की रेखा चित्र बनती है तो उसमें उपस्थित सभी की महत्वपूर्ण भूमिकाएं होती हैं। इसी प्रकार एजी में उपस्थित हर युवाओं की राय ली जाती है। एजी के द्वारा प्रोजेक्ट का कार्यक्रम काफ़ी अच्छा हो जाता है, जिसके कारण एक अच्छा रूप मिलता है कार्यक्रम को, और इसके द्वारा जो बात हम लोगों तक पहुंचाना चाहते हैं वो काफ़ी अच्छी तरीके से पहुंच सकती है। एंड थैंक यू सो मच।
So that's Rohit, and in the next slide, you will see him in his dance costume in all the glory that's there. So what did we learn with our experiences of engaging with adolescents? So first of all, what we learned is that this process of co-creation is also an empowering one for the adolescents. You just heard Rohit speaking about it, and he felt great that, his ideas were taken in, that they were incorporated. He also learned new things that he wasn't aware of earlier. And we also feel that this process of co-creation ensures that the intervention is culturally and locally relevant. And once it is locally relevant, the scalability of it increases because it becomes much more inclusive. And just a point here is when we talk to the children or when we have engaged with them, we have not said that this is a cluster randomized controlled trial. We call it a project because that is what they really understand and are able to connect with. So we've not used researchy language, but we've used language which children are accustomed to and which they are able to really understand. We've also found that co-creation has made it possible for us to source adolescents who've had lived experiences of mental disorders. In fact, there is a film that we have made having Rohit as one of the main people, and he shares his experiences, which he briefly mentioned here, about how the dance put him into stress because it was not accepted by the community, and then how he finally dealt with it. In other projects that we've had a long struggle to try and get people to actually, contribute lived experience videos because they were not part of the co-creation process. And in fact, it was the AEAG themselves who told us that we should make videos like this because it will help other adolescents to connect to them and, to understand what they went through. Then I have a little thing that I would really like to flag here, which is around ethical dilemmas. So it's not that, engaging with the AEAG is just a one-off thing and only around the campaign. Rather, this whole project that we are running, this whole research work that we are doing, consciously tries to engage with adolescents at all stages. And not just the AEAG, but adolescents generally in the community with whom we are having this discussion. So we were doing screening, to screen children using a mental health tool, which is called the PHQ-9, that helps to identify adolescents who might be at high risk for depression and suicide. And when we found these adolescents who had very high scores, we had a conversation with them because protocol mandated that we should share it with their parents because they were underage, and we should urge them to go and seek help. But when we shared this information with the adolescents, they were absolutely upset. And they said, you can't, share it with our parents. We've told you this in confidence. In some cases, parents themselves were the cause of stress. And we said, but then we are, obligated by ethical requirements. We have to tell your parents, you must go and seek help. And then finally, through various methods, several meetings, we finally asked the adolescent, what is it that you want us to tell your parents so that it is acceptable to you. It won't put you into danger, but you will get the help you need. And we came up with messages that we tailored for each child so that we could have a conversation with their guardians, their parents, and urge them to take this child to a health facility. And in fact, what we said is we call it so there is something that the Delhi government and the Andhra Pradesh government runs. These are adolescent-friendly health clinics, and they have counselors there. So instead of telling them to go to a psychiatrist, we said, please take them to this, adolescent-friendly clinic, get them checked by a counselor. And we linked it up with COVID. We said, because of COVID, adolescents are stressed. They are unable to go to school, online classes. And, so you should just take them and have this conversation. They will feel better. And that was well received. And we were able to really have this communication. Next slide, please. So to conclude, we feel that the AEAG has really strengthened the adolescent practitioner and research collaboration, and the partnership that this partnership has provided us with very rich and useful insights. And we feel our program has been enriched because of this. As I mentioned earlier, having these kind of collaborations will ensure that your program is more culturally and locally relevant and therefore more acceptable. And when you have research with children, what we learned is that it's essential to engage with them, especially if these children are marginalized and vulnerable, like our children who live in the slums, and to find solutions in discussion with them. Just ask the children, they know it. And it's extremely important to maintain a balance between the interest of the child as well as recognize their own right, to exert their competencies and respect that. Can I have the next slide, please? So I think this is the end where we have our young people who were in the video. So this was the street play people, and they are adolescent expert advisory group members. Thank you so much, and I hope I haven't overshot my time.
Not at all, not at all. Thank you so much, Dr. Sandhya. So a couple of questions, one in the chat. How many members were in the AEAG?
So each group had about 15 members, and there are 3 groups.
Interesting. And tell me, did the ethics committee review, you can come back onto screen if you can, your video will permit it. How did the ethics committee work with you once they said you needed to tell their parents? How did you deal with that?
So what we did is that the protocol mandated that we have to, inform the parents. So there was no 2 ways about it. The problem was, how do you translate it on the ground into a way that's acceptable to adolescents? So we also consulted other experts who work with adolescents routinely to try and find out what they did when they were, encountered with such a situation. We didn't get any clear answers because they hadn't faced anything like this. So then we said, okay, let's try. So, we went back to the adolescents several times. We spoke to them. We asked them, okay, if it's not your parents, can we ask some other trusted adult, maybe a relative, maybe a teacher, and they can communicate this message. But the children were absolutely against it. So finally, when we discussed with them, we told them, okay, is it all right if we don't disclose your scores and we don't tell them that, this, the PHQ-9 and administering it has caused us to come to this conclusion, but we can just link it up with COVID and say you're very, very stressed because you're missing classes, or you're not able to go out and you're not able to meet with your friends. So keep it more generic, so that parents are also not alarmed. And so children also told us that they told us things in confidence, right? Confidentiality, and we were going to be breaking that and breaching that. So we said, let's do it in a way where it's acceptable. Everyone knows that people are stressed because of COVID. So maybe that will just make it easier. So through trial and error, we finally came to messages that were acceptable to them, and we use that to communicate with parents.
So in the future, how would you have set this up differently if you would have?
So that's a tough question to ask, but I think what we might have done in future is also perhaps started with meetings with the parents, just to tell them that children might be stressed, they might be upset because of many factors. And these factors are sometimes not in our control because they're also external to us. And when we have children who are stressed, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are mad, which is what most parents, jump to the conclusion. But they just need a little bit of help with some trained person who's able to counsel them and make them feel better. So maybe have that conversation and then start the screening. But this could also be wishful because there are timelines to be met, and sometimes it takes a lot of time. But we have taken these learnings very seriously, and in fact, when our intervention rolls out in later this year, we will first start with a series of engagement with parents, and then go on to actually, the anti-stigma and other work around it.
Yeah. And each of the parent-child dyads were consented or assented for participation. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. That's right. Without that, we do not do it. So there are cases where parents have not given their consent and we've not been able to do the screening. There are cases where parents have given the consent, but children have not given their assent.
Yeah.
So we have not been able to do that either. So it's only when both consent and assent are obtained can we do it for the younger adolescents.
Right. Wonderful work, really impressive. Does anyone else have questions before we go on? I just want to make sure that I'm not. So are you going to be able to stay for the?
Yes, I will stay on till the end.
That's great, because questions may arrive. But and just thank Rohit from us. Such an impressive person and so genuine in his communication. It really is both touching and instructive to hear from him not only what he's gone through, but what the support of your program has meant to him. So thank you.
I will certainly commit. Thank you so much for having us. And it is just too early in the morning, otherwise he would have been live.
Yeah, of course. We could be the reason he's missing yet more school. So thank you. And we're now going to play a second video, which was put together by our parent collaborator, Gigi McMillan in California, also to sort of elicit the voices of young people. You've heard from Megan, you'll hear from her again. And then we asked our panelists to watch the video and respond to what they heard and how they think that we should be incorporating what they have to say into our practices. At the end of this, I can tell you that we had really wanted to have these kids with us. We were aware that it's probably not fair in their schedule to join us in real time, but we did decide that we would share with them, since nothing about us without us, as we heard from in the last video. We were going to share the discussion of this panel with the three contributors again and hear their reactions to what the parent or what the adults had to say. With that, let me invite Jen to begin this video.
The MRCT Center presents Time to Listen, hearing from young people in clinical research. We asked some children about their experience in clinical research. Their answers will help strengthen your partnership with pediatric participants.
I'm Jan, and I'm 16 years old, almost 17. I'm from Barcelona in Spain.
Ma'am, my name is Sandhya, and I am 18 years old, and I'm from India.
My name is Megan. I'm 11 years old, and I'm from the United States of America. And I think that adults can learn a thing or two from kids.
What is it like when a doctor or researcher talks to you?
I really don't like it when they talk to the adult, but they don't talk to me, because it's as if they think that my opinion doesn't matter.
मैम ऐसा लगता है कि मैम जब बीमारी मेरी है तो मैम डॉक्टर डायरेक्टली मुझसे क्यों नहीं बात कर रहे हैं और मेरे पेरेंट्स से क्यों बोल रहे हैं मैम ऐसी फीलिंग्स आती है और फिर लगता है कि मतलब कुछ तो है और डॉक्टर मुझे नहीं बता रहे हैं.
If I was younger, maybe I should not listen to all of it. My parents, I would say, would have to choose which thing I would have to hear and which thing not.
What is the best way to give you information?
I like it when they use visual information and schemes or videos, which help me understand the medical procedure itself. I don't like when they just use their voice, because sometimes it's hard when they say a lot of things to remember and understand them correctly. In an ideal world, a 3D model of in this case, imagine a tumor. You could see from all the angles and you could really understand the situation. So you were less scared when you went into the procedure. So maybe that's the best way you could be handed information, but maybe it's not that realistic nowadays.
When I understand the most is when I'm actually talking to someone and know that I can say something back and that they can fill me in on more if they need to.
मैम उनको फ्रेंडली होना चाहिए क्योंकि अगर मैं एज ए लड़की हूँ या फिर गर्ल हूँ तो मैम उनको ना फ्रेंडली होना चाहिए. जिस एज के अकॉर्डिंग उनके पास पेशेंट्स जा रहे हैं उस एज के अकॉर्डिंग उनको फ्रेंडली होना चाहिए. उनका जो बॉडी लैंग्वेज और बात करने का तरीका, वे ऑफ टॉकिंग, ताकि जो सामने वाला पर्सन है वो कंफर्टेबली उनसे शेयर कर सके जो भी उसकी प्रॉब्लम है.
What is it like to ask questions?
Sometimes I hold it in because I'm scared that maybe I'll appear stupid.
The doctors know a lot more about this procedure you're going into, or the clinical study you're going to enroll in. But with the parents, they know your personality and your feelings better. So there's two kinds of questions, and you ask the doctor more about the medical stuff and the parent more about the personal stuff.
मैम थोड़ी हेजिटेशन होती है क्योंकि सामने जो इससे हम क्वेश्चन पूछ रहे हैं वो उनके पास ज्यादा इंफॉर्मेशन है. और सर मैम थोड़ा ये भी लगता है कि जब उनके पास इंफॉर्मेशन है तो मेरे पास भी थोड़ा बहुत तो होना चाहिए.
Do you think that adults really listen to kids?
Sometimes say that they're listening, but they're actually doing something else and looking away and they don't understand. We kids need to recognize the difference between people who say that they're listening but actually aren't, and people who say they're listening and actually are.
जब वो प्रोजेक्ट हमारे लिए काम कर रहा है तो उसमें हमारी भागीदारी होती है. उसमें हमारे ओपिनियंस पूछे जाते हैं. हम जो फील करते हैं, हम जिस चीज से सफर करते हैं, वो सारी इंफॉर्मेशन प्रोग्राम जो भी है उनके हेड वो सब लेते हैं और मैम उसमें हमारी पूरी भागीदारी होती है.
I'm in Kids Barcelona, so in my point of view, I am really being heard because I am in an advisory group. Doctors and specialists come to us even when they have questions they want us to answer. But I can understand and I can relate to other patients that are not involved in this kind of groups, that they really can feel powerless.
What is one important thing that you want adults to know?
I think it's essential for the parents to understand the information as well as the children, because the parents are the ones that know their son or daughter best, so they can afterwards explain it to the patient, to their son or daughter. And also it's necessary and really important to ask the patient how they want the information to be delivered, because I would say they are the ones that know better themselves how they will understand the information better.
We all know that adults were kids once. They were just like us. They felt the need to be loved and to be listened to. So I don't think that it's so necessary for them to learn to listen to kids, but to relearn what it's like to need to be listened to.
ऐसा एटमॉस्फेयर होना चाहिए जो बच्चे उसमें कंफर्टेबल हो, जो कोऑर्डिनेटर्स हो उनका बिहेवियर फ्रेंडली होना चाहिए बच्चों से, ताकि बच्चे उनके साथ अच्छे से कोऑर्डिनेट कर सके, वर्क कर सके और जो भी प्रोग्राम है उसमें अच्छे से पार्टिसिपेट कर सके। बिकॉज अगर एटमॉस्फेयर और जो भी प्रोग्राम का कोऑर्डिनेटर है उसका और फ्रेंडली बिहेवियर होगा तो बच्चे उसमें, हमारे जैसे बच्चे उसमें अच्छे से पार्टिसिपेट कर पाएंगे।
If you could interview a researcher or a doctor, what would you ask?
तो मतलब वो जो भी है जो भी पेशेंट है उसको कैसे फेथ दिलाएंगे कि हाँ वो जल्दी ठीक हो जाएगा या फिर उसका डर दूर हो जाए बस।
If I had a researcher in front of me, 3 specific questions that I would probably ask them. 1, do you even remember what it's like to be a kid? That would be a preface to dig a little deeper. 2, I would ask them, why am I important to your career? And once I understand and make sure that they understand how I'm important to their career, I would ask them, how can I help you do a good job helping me?
Key points. Talk directly to the child. Use visual forms of information. Create a comfortable environment. Remember what it was like to be a kid. Children are nervous about asking questions. Youth advisory groups can access the child voice. Parents are part of the information delivery process. Help children help you to do a better job.
And now we need to think of one more question that's maybe not so scary.
I don't do things that aren't scary. I don't do that. I want to look threatening.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Really compelling and a lot of resonance between the first video and the second. And now to unpack this and to really get into the details of the application of what we've heard, I'm going to introduce the moderator, Dr. Thierry Lacaz from the University of Calgary in Canada. And the 2 speakers, Sheila Varadhan, the independent child rights legal researcher from Thailand, and Dr. Min-Soo Park, the Severance Children's Hospital in Korea. So we're looking very much forward to hearing how you interpret and apply what we've been hearing today. Thank you, Terry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barbara and Lisa and all the team at the MRCT for organizing this wonderful webinar. I'm extremely grateful to be invited here to provide a little bit of my perspective that I acquired through my career of neonatologist and clinician scientist, trained in France and immigrating to Canada 20 years ago. I've lived in the various places of this country, and I had been fortunate enough to be offered to take the position of scientific director of our national maternal, infant, child, and youth research network. It's called MyCERN. MyCERN is a network which joined the 21 maternal child health research organizations in Canada. And we are also affiliated with more than 25 practice-based research network. Our principal role and mandate is to improve the quality and impact of research through the provisions of a coordinated infrastructure to support investigator and research team in being successful in their studies. We are really focusing on multi-jurisdictional studies. Canada is a complicated country. It's federations of multiple provinces, and provinces have their own legislations in regards to research and that makes the conductions of multi-center study quite complicated, and this is why we need some kind of national infrastructure. I am, clinician scientist now for more than 25 years, and I have been, I've been involved in many clinical trials and prospective studies over my career. And I have to admit, after those 25 years, I'm still, learning a lot. And I have to, admit that conducting and being successful in clinical research is incredibly difficult and require a lot of support and training. And maybe the most important, and if I can have the next slide, is the understanding of why it is so important to bring the different stakeholders involved in the research journey, and why initiative such as the one that you are leading, Barbara, is critical. Every stakeholder has its own perspective. They have their priority, they have their mandate given by the government, the funding agency, the sponsor, and those mandates and those priorities not always align together, meaning that even if everybody wants the study to be conducted in the best way, with the most appropriate design, and with the appropriate fundings, it does not mean that study is actually going to be successful. And it's often because there has not been an understanding and a recognition of the importance of the perspective of each of those stakeholders. I'm not going to go through each of the perspective and considerations that those stakeholders are having. I can give maybe a couple of examples. So for instance, the founders that are not always the sponsor, they are in the case of industry, but for academic or investigator-led trials, the founders are a public agency that has the mandate to distribute a relatively small amount of funding through a very competitive process. And funders will be looking at the quality of the project, but they won't be taking in account the voice of the patients, and for studies involving children and young people, their voice as well. So the priority determined by the investigators that put a grant forward does not always, or certainly not until recently, incorporate the voice of the participants. And then a project can be actually very highly ranked, but it does not actually meet the fundamental requirements and the priority of the participants, which means that it's unlikely that this project is actually going to full completion. Another example is the healthcare providers that are not always the investigators. And I'm thinking as a neonatologist to my colleagues, nurses working at the bedside of the babies having critical illness, and the tendency, which is very legitimate for those providers, to consider research not as something that should be promoted, but more as a burden or an additional layer of works or responsibility that they may not be willing to take. So there is a need for those stakeholders to have conversations, to understand each other, and to work together to ensure that the research journey will go from A to Z with success and will meet the requirements and the expectations of the participating children, young people, and parents. If I can spend a few minutes on the perspective of those children, young people, and parents, Their perspective is complex, and it's always an emotionally charged process to engage a child, a young people, or a family in the process of consenting and feeling part of the process, to be a participant, but also a patient. There is a lot of challenge, I think, in the medical system today, where the clinical research team is not well integrated with the clinical care team, and there can be misunderstanding about the role of each individual, which create confusions. And actually, we heard that a little bit with the video, where there was the possibility of a confusion between the role of the doctors as providing care versus the role of the doctor as investigators approaching and engaging the child in the study. Studies are more and more often quite invasive. They can be time-consuming. The retentions and adherence is very demanding, and we don't always take in account what does it mean for a child, the time that needs to be spent to be part of the study, and whether we can find some process and some way to facilitate their participations. We tend to think that the child has to come to the hospital instead of the opposite, where we should develop process to actually go to the child, whether it's at school, at the gym, in the swimming pool, or other place where part of the trial can actually be conducted, whether it's collecting data, for instance. There is another piece that we have been hearing many times, and the other panelists will certainly allude to that and elaborate on that. Each country and each society has its own ethnic, historical, and cultural barrier for when it pertains to be engaged in a clinical study. And in Canada, which is a very multicultural country, we know, and I know by experience, that we don't make all the effort to ensure that some of our patients in the hospital are approached in a neutral way and are given the opportunity to be part of the trials. And it's because of misunderstanding, it's because of mistrust, and we really need to develop process to ensure that it does not happen, because there are two consequences of that. One is that some families and some children are not given the opportunity to be part of a trial and to potentially benefits of a new treatments. And of course, the final results of the trial is unlikely to be valid and to be generalizable to the whole populations because of this sort of recruitment bias. We talk about difficulty for children and family to come to the institutions. So we need to work with the regulators and the sponsor on process to facilitate the trial to be conducted at close to the family. Some family don't have the ability to be, because of time or because of fundings, to actually participate to trial because of time, distance, limitations of access, public transport, and others issues. So there is an increased but very legitimate ask for engaging and partnering with patients, not only in the design of the study itself, in the identifications of the research questions, but in all aspects of the trial to ensure that they are engaged and to ensure that we understand their need and their perspective. And I will finish my brief talk by going back to this very comprehensive and very moving report published in 2015, which I read often chapters because it's actually big documents. It's the Nuffield Council of Bioethics report. And I quote here 2 questions, which I try to remember, as most every day, if possible. The questions are, can we ethically undertake the research needed to ensure that children and young people healthcare services are safe and effective, given that research often involves burden and risk? And behind these questions, there is, for me as a neonatologist, the constant questions I have when I practice. Why do we continue to give so many medications to neonates when we don't have the formal answer in regards to their safety and their efficacy? So provision of service, safe and effective, means that we need more research to get more data to ensure that what we do in the hospital or at the bedside is based by the appropriate evidence. And therefore, what role should children, young people, and parents themselves play in influencing how research studies are carried out, and how can their voice help influence the wider research agenda? I think this is a very fundamental question, and I'm glad that there are more and more opportunity and recognitions that this is critical. And at least in Canada, and I know that in many other jurisdictions, there is this recognitions, and there is actually a lot of initiatives that are now launched that hopefully would influence and provide, an answer to those questions. I am finishing here, and I would like to hand over to one of my panelists, Sheila Varadhan. And Sheila is based in Thailand. She's a researcher. She is going to elaborate on those important issues. And Sheila, if I can give you the floor.
Thank you, Thierry, for that really gracious introduction. And I really want to thank Lisa and Barbara and the whole MRCT team for putting together 2 excellent webinars and really offering a space to discuss the role of children's rights in the clinical research setting. I'm quite grateful for that, so thank you. Now, briefly, I would like to, if I can go back to the opening slide, just talk about what we saw in the video and the insightful and eloquent comments from Megan, John, and Sandhya, and really unpack what we saw at the end of the video, the list of summary points, and that is what it means to talk directly to children and accessing the voice of the child, and really what it means to listen to children, and how importantly, how we can support parents and carers. So if we can go to the next slide. As a starting point, we really want to underscore this idea that children are rights holders in the international and national setting. And we often hear the word children's rights, human rights being thrown around a lot in various different contexts. And I want to unpack what that means and why it's important, specifically in the context of clinical research. So going back a little bit, taking one step back and looking at traditional research ethics and human subject ethics, what we've seen historically is children and other research participants who are deemed incapable of providing informed consent being treated or viewed as non-autonomous beings and categorized as vulnerable. Now, what this means is while they're able to access research, it's in a very restricted way. And the overarching concern is protecting them from the research environment rather than facilitating and enabling their participation in research. In the context of children, it's also quite unique because children legally have been presumed incompetent or incapable of making legal decisions. So at a legal level, in addition to the ethics dimension, children are not seen as being able to provide valid consent or being able to engage in valid decision-making. So between these 2 dimensions, traditional research ethics and the legal frameworks for consent and competence, we have a confusing situation where it's not entirely clear how or to what extent children should be engaged in decision-making or discussions and research, because the ethical and legal value of the participation is not entirely clear. And in that sense, human rights and the legal framework of human rights might provide a different vantage point to negotiate these two dimensions, ethics and law, traditional ethics and law, in a way that enables children's participation to have a little bit more meaning and value. So going to the next slide and reiterating what Megan and Sandhya said, we see this in practical circumstances where children often feel they're not seen in the discussions that take place in the doctor's office. And this again might be a function of simply how we've come to view the role of children through the lens of traditional research ethics and traditional legal frameworks for decision making. So if we can move to the next slide, what really is important about and unique about international law is what it brings in terms of a different vantage point to negotiate the relationship and the role children should have. So when we say children are rights holders under international law, we're referring to an international legal instrument, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think most people have heard of this because it's actually a very, very well accepted international instrument. It was adopted in 1989, as Sandhya mentioned in the keynote, and it really changed how children are viewed in the research setting in some jurisdictions, but not all. And that is really because the CRC has been signed by every country in the world and acceded to and ratified by every country but the United States. And so what that means is it has a lot of global currency. So in the context of research, what does it actually change or do for us? As a starting point, it says that all children are recognized as rights holders, even very young children, infants, toddlers. So it kind of delinks the idea of capacity or competence being a precursor to being able to have rights or being able to be seen as an individual. And that very much breaks from the traditional research ethics perspective that emphasizes autonomy and very much individualism. So this rights dimension allows us to view children's role and their place in research as individuals, irrespective of whether they can give valid ethical or legal consent. And this really speaks to the notion of assent in children's dissent and assent in children's participation in the decision-making process, and what value that should be given in the overall research setting. But it also speaks to the issue of children's engagement in research design and various different points in the research cycle. At a technical level, the instrument, the International Convention on the Rights of the Child, requires states to take active measures to implement it in their national law. So what that means is it requires measures that allow children to be heard, that support children in how they express their views, and that engage children in a meaningful and purposeful way. And so I've mentioned 3 or 4 articles and provisions that really speak to that. And what I want to do now is unpack those and link them to the comments and the various different suggestions that we heard from Megan, Jan, and Sandhya. So if we can go to the next slide. Now, it's important to think about what we mean when we say listening to children and accessing children's voices. What I've brought forward here is a model of engagement or child participation, and it actually is taken from the CRC. So as I said before, the CRC creates a set of obligations. States have to actively do things to enable children to exercise and enjoy their rights. And one of those things is the right to be heard and enabling children to be able to be heard. So what we've heard from Megan, Sandhya, and John and Megan really pointed this out very vividly, is that there's a big difference between just hearing children and actually listening to them. And part of that is the various different aspects and mechanisms that we have in place to listen to children. And John and Sandhya pointed this out, and John really pointed out the difference he felt because he was on an advisory committee, and to have doctors come and ask his opinion. And Sandhya pointed out how she felt to have her ideas and opinions incorporated. And so what we're really speaking to is not necessarily hearing children, but putting mechanisms in place to enable children's views and perspectives to be incorporated and taken seriously. Now, this model is the Lundy Model. It was developed by Professor Laura Lundy from Queen's University in Belfast. And what she's done is broken down how we listen to children to 4 key components, and asked us or invited us to really think about what it means to give children the space and inclusive opportunities to express their views, and that their voice should be supported and facilitated so they're able to express themselves in a way that meets their needs and their capacities in the situation they're in. But importantly, there should also be someone who's listening. So not just hearing, but actively taking into account what they're saying. And that is an audience, whether it's a doctor or a youth advisory committee. And that audience must then take those views and do something with them. And that's not to say that you always have to incorporate the views of children or follow them, but that you have to engage with children about what you're going to do with them. So if you choose to incorporate them, you share that with the child, but equally if you choose not to, or you're unable to, that is also expressed or conveyed to the child. So it's really this idea of not just hearing the child, but putting into place a mechanism that enables children the space, the safety, the support, and the influence and audience they need to be heard. Now, going further to the next slide, they've actually, Laura Lundy and are we on the next slide? I can't see. Yes. So Laura Lundy and the Queen's University of Belfast have actually created a series of tools, one of which is a checklist. And this allows various stakeholders, researchers, other adults to engage in children in a consistent way, and then to test whether their engagement is actually meaningful, to test whether they're able to meaningfully talk to the child. And so seizing on the 4 elements, space, voice, audience, influence, we have to ask ourselves, what are the things that we're putting into place to give children a sense of having a safe environment, a sense of having time to be listened to? And Megan drew this out by telling us how she felt when people actually spoke to her, and she had an opportunity to talk back. So both the space and the interaction. John spoke to us or highlighted the importance of supporting and meeting children at where they are in terms of supporting their capacities to express their views. So in some cases that might be visual forms of communication. In other cases, it would be visual aids or different mechanisms or tools to be able to support children and meet them in a way that they're able to understand the medical procedures. And the idea of influence and audience, those are important, and we'll have different approaches depending on whether it's a youth advisory committee, it's a one-on-one discussion, or whether children are feeding into the research cycle at a various other point. But it's important to recognize that there's no one way to engage in children. And while these are tools, they will have to be adapted to both the context and the culture of where the children are being engaged with, and to enable them to express their views. And this really brings us to the last slide and the last point I want to make, and perhaps it's the most complex one. If we can move to the next slide, it's the role of parents and caregivers. And John really brought this out in talking about how parents really play an integral role in how children understand their information, how they're able to express their views. And understanding the dynamics of the family is both complex, and navigating those dynamics in the framework of laws and ethical regulations is further complex. And this, again, is made all the more difficult with different cultural contexts. So Sandhya, in her keynote, talked about the various different strategies they engaged to negotiate the law, the requirements of the law to obtain parental consent and to disclose information to parents with children's rights to be heard and to access research and their own comfort level and the rights to be respected, their privacy. So there's no quick and short answers in terms of how we engage with parents and family and how we negotiate these various different pieces. But the interesting dimension, the important dimension that rights-based frameworks bring is giving us an avenue to negotiate these different powers and authorities in a way that sees the child's dignity and rights, and sees the child's right to be heard and to be engaged as an individual. And the other thing that the CRC framework specifically might be able to do to support children and to support this process is offer kind of a long game. And by being a universally ratified treaty and instrument, it requires and allows us to engage in the dialogue of rights and engage in various campaign raising or campaign awareness raising, different mechanisms and activities that build up awareness for rights. So the idea that a child could be a rights holder, the idea that children should be listened to, is something that will be slowly built upon over time and will feed into ideas of assent and child engagement and parent-child decision-making, and will eventually contribute to an easier kind of process to negotiate these different cultural, structural, legal, and ethical dimensions of assent in the hopes of actually fostering more meaningful engagement and listening to children. And the last slide I wanted to end with is really this idea, and this is from the early child rights pioneer Janis Korsich, that children are often seen as human becomings, as people of tomorrow that need to be protected today. But what Janis Korsich and others have shown us is that children are people of today, and they have views, they have ideas that are meaningful, important to them and to us. As Megan told us, parents or adults can learn a thing or two from children. And really, her words of, I think she said this in the video, is one of the most important things we can do, or ways to stand up to the world, is to stand up for yourself first. And to be able to do that, children need to be seen as people today. And so the CRC framework, while it doesn't provide answers, it provides us the ground and the foundation to build upon this idea that children need to be seen and heard in the moment, and to slowly accumulate understanding of how to do that through its framework of engagement and participation. So I'm going to stop there, and I appreciate your patience, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sheila. It was very inspiring, and I really like how you extract the message that we heard, with the video, and you put that in this framework and this context. I think that was really fascinating, and I'm sure there will be a few questions coming after. It's also my pleasure to introduce our last panelist, Dr. Min So Park. Dr. Min So Park is a pediatrician per training. He's a neonatologist and a clinical pharmacologist. He's based in Korea at the Severance Children's Hospital, and he's going to provide us with his perspective. Please, Dr. Min So Park, go ahead.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you for the introduction. I think most important points have been already mentioned by Terry and Sheila, and probably I might have to echo both of them in my talk. So I will share some examples of the cultural differences that you might encounter in terms of dealing with children in clinical trials, especially in my country, because coincidentally, I'm also in neonatology, and I have some experience with younger children, mostly infants, but I do not really have direct experience with older children, adolescents being involved in my clinical trials. So I had to ask around my colleagues, and I can share some of the experiences that they have with regard to hearing the voices of the adolescents and older children in clinical trials. Well, most of you will agree that in the past and even in modern days, many Asian parents have been depicted in the mass media as stern and domineering figures about deciding what is good for their children and telling them what to do, especially with regard to education and behavior, etc. And perhaps even in schools, students are mostly silent during classes and rarely ask questions to their teachers. This is just a cultural thing, you know. Even though they are encouraged to ask questions nowadays, you know, most of the students are very silent, and unless they are asked personally, they try to keep their mouth shut. So probably with this kind of a background in culture, I think, you know, when I think of the situations in Korea, it is not much different in real life, although things are changing nowadays rapidly, and there are variations among different families, of course. And as far as making health-related decisions for the children are concerned, parents seem to take the primary responsibility, if not sole responsibility, whether they talk with their children to draw a conclusion or not. As in other countries, I'm not quite sure how it's been, the regulations in other countries are really, but Korean GCP and IRB regulations emphasize the importance of explaining details about the trials to the potentially participating children and to obtain assent from them in addition to the parental consents. Of course, the parents are the primary persons. First, to get the information about trials, mostly from the physicians in charge of the care of their children. And secondly, to decide to have their children participate in the trials or not. At the same time, physicians first talk with parents, not with children first. And if parents decide to have their children, it's appropriate to have their children participate in a trial, physicians then may have a chance to talk with the children, mostly for the obtaining assents. Of course, the process of getting assent from school-age children and adolescents is a must and is to be executed as guided. But most children seem to have been told by their parents about the trials beforehand and rely on their parents' decision to passively give their assents. Whether this passive behavior is based on respect or reverence of their parents' decision, or based on prior agreement between the children and their parents through a thorough discussion of the trials, it's not clear. Rarely, some children raise questions about what kinds of discomfort they might go through and whether their routine schedule of schoolwork or extracurricular learning activities might be interfered by the trials, which also may have been checked by their parents prior to the assent process. Now, it doesn't really mean that parents totally leave out their children in decision-making process. More recently, parents are more open with their children in the process, especially when the trials involve invasive or painful procedures or take up much of their children's time out of school. Nowadays, even though there's a great variability among different families, children are more outspoken and their opinions or questions are more respected and welcome than in the past. However, it is still common that children tend to respond to questions or ask questions only when they are asked to, rather than spontaneously asking questions or making comments. So I think in this kind of cultural background, I think it is crucial to solicit questions from children with regard to various aspects of trials. In the process, it would be critical that they should be given enough time in a child-friendly environment and manner. That's for the older children and adolescents, but for younger children and toddlers, probably between the age of 2 and 6, who we assume that they lack competence of understanding the concept of clinical research and are incapable of independent decision-making for their own health. So it is a whole different story, and probably we could share this thing, and this area perhaps deserves a whole new webinar. But I will try to point out a couple of things. The decision for participation is wholly up to the parents in these with these younger children and infants. Children who are capable of understanding what they might have to go through are usually told beforehand and are most often persuaded, or not, if not forced, to come along by the parents. So the parents are the most important persons that physicians should properly inform, make sure that these parents fully understand what it means to have the children participate in the research and make the right decision in their children's behalf and probably for their best interest. However, we should also consider that such competency depends on individual capability. Some children, for example, some children who have gone through painful hospital experiences due to chronic and life-threatening illnesses are often insightful enough to understand what can be expected from a trial. These children deserve more respect as an individual involved in the decision-making process. Parents and physicians need to properly assess children's competence in this with this respect. Time to time, there's a few children who overtly express their unwillingness to go through the procedures required in trials. In such cases, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, and perhaps not suitable for participation. Some of the routine checkups and exams, such as simple blood draws or shots, can be a dreadful experience and could be an object of fear to children. So we can say that it could be considered as a minimal risk to adults, but it can be deemed as more than minimal risk to children. With respect to newborn infants, as a neonatologist, I have some experience dealing with the parents of newborn babies, both very sick, very premature, and also very healthy. For very sick babies, such as extremely preterm infants, they must go through a series of distressful procedures. Often their life is on the verge of collapse at any time. Many times we might have to resort to off-label drug uses or experimental treatment options, which most parents agree to opt in, perhaps because they think that these attempts are considered the best possible choice at hand for their babies. However, if the same have been offered as a part of a clinical research, most parents tend to decline, most likely because their babies would not get proper treatment, and as a individual patient, so they would, decline to participate in the trial as a subject in the trial. They would want their babies to be treated better than some kind of guinea pig or experimental subjects. It's much more difficult when it comes to healthy full-term babies, especially when we do vaccine studies in healthy full-term babies. Recently, we had to go through, had to have a new vaccines or preventive therapeutics that would prevent the occurrence of respiratory syncytial virus infection in preterm babies and also full-term babies. We had a very difficult time obtaining consents from parents. It seems that when parents are asked to consider the participation in the trials, the level of evidence for safety and efficacy required by and also satisfactory to the parents seem to be much higher than for older children or adults. Even a few blood draws is not tolerable to parents of newborn babies who are not sick. Not to mention the administration of an investigational product that is unproven yet for its safety and efficacy. So the parents of these newborn babies are viewed as overprotective sometimes, but is it really being protective by not enrolling their children in the trials? Is protection really a right word? Anyway, we should do something to change the situation. We need to understand better what the parents are going through during the early days of their after their baby's birth, and we need to have the parents to properly and more reasonably assess current situation and what would be the best decision for their babies. It's a lot of different stories mingled together, and I try to share some of my thoughts with you guys, and I hope my presentation would have been helpful in the discussion of protecting children and also having the voices of children participating in the trials. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Min. That was very inspiring, the experience of a neonatologist. I certainly understand the challenge having, work with families at the bedside with baby, suffering from critical conditions. So this is wonderful. I think we have time for a question. So if you please have any questions, please put it in the Q&A box. I certainly have one for Sheila, which I think is quite relevant after what we heard, from the children in the video. And of course, it's something that we have whole experience when we are trying to engage families and children in a study. So in your perspective, what should we listen to when the child has an opinion that differs from her parents? And I think it's a question for you, Sheila, but please, any other panelists can step in as well.
I can speak to it from a legal perspective, but I would very much welcome the insights of the other panelists and speakers. Surely Sandhya was talking about this very much in her keynote. From a child rights perspective, the issue of parent-child disagreements is complex, and I won't presuppose that there's any clear, quick, or universal answer. But the one thing that we do have to remember is that children's capacities evolve. So they evolve from infancy to adulthood, And that evolution is not fixed. They're not clear benchmarks, and children don't automatically become completely competent or autonomous at the age of 18. So how a child is able to engage, understand decision-making will very much be influenced on their personal lived experiences, genetics, family, cultural values, the context in which they grew up. So as a researcher, you're given quite a daunting task to assess the complexity and the constellation of those factors. From a child rights perspective, it could be said that the closer the child gets to acquiring those capacities and evolving to the point where their decision-making does reach the level of understanding and maturity that it could be taken as ethically valid, then the more likely or the more of a responsibility you have to listen to the child. And I'd like to direct you actually to the Nuffield Council of Bioethics. They wrote an incredibly insightful and useful report some years ago in 2015 on children's participation in clinical research. And they made this point very clearly that even if the law says a child does not meet the threshold of legal consent, there's an ethical duty to take that child's decision seriously, particularly as they approach a point where they have the understanding, capacity, and maturity to be able to engage in decision making. So with that in mind, when you're negotiating a difference between parents and children, you really have to think of the ethical duty you have to that child based on their extent to engage in that decision.
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. Sandy, what's your perspective on this issue? And I'm sure that this is something that you have experienced, with your trial and maybe others. And what's the context in India around how do we deal when there is this conflict? And so
it's a tough thing in the sense that, as Dr. Park said, in India, maybe not to that extent, but parents definitely are the people who take decisions, and children are considered to be children. So they are expected to follow decisions. And this varies across settings. So like, for example, in Delhi, you still have children who have what might be described as a rebellious spirit, in the sense that they will give their views, and they might do things that parents don't really agree to. But in a context like down south, where generally, they are more obedient, within inverted commas, within quotes, more obedient, they would not, for example, challenge what parents say. So it's a very tough situation. It's a difficult situation for us. You cannot discount parents, because in the end, they are the ones who are going to, physically allow a child to participate. So you might hold several programs, but if parents do not send their children to participate in it, then you don't have that participation. So you have to engage with parents, and you have to convince them that whatever we are doing as researchers is for the benefit of the child. The child is going to, in the long run, benefit from it, and not just their child, but other children. So, unless and until we are able to do that convincing, it's difficult. Now, for us, it's been slightly easier because we have selected areas where we have partner NGOs who've been working for a very long time in the community. So there is that kind of, trust in the partner. They know that the partner is doing something for the benefit of the child. And therefore, it's become slightly easier for us to engage. But if you go to a totally new area where nobody knows you and you have no presence, and then you try to tell parents, okay, we want your children to participate in XYZ, you will not get any traction. So, I'm also going to link this up to a class kind of issue, because we've been struggling in another project where we've been trying to study the impacts of COVID-19 on the mental well-being of children. And we've actually been able to do a lot in a slum setting. We've gone face-to-face, we've had interactions, we've collected data. And we try to do this for the middle-class children, through schools. So we said, okay, let's get in touch with the schools and then access the children and try and get the information. I'm telling you, we did not even get 10 consents from the parents online. So it's just impossible unless you consent unless you have parents on your side. So we just, we have to leave that bit out because there is no consent and there is no way in which you can communicate with parents face to face. So they see you and say, okay, these people look authentic. They will not do anything which is, harmful for a child. Online, there's only so much you can do. So these challenges certainly exist.
Well, thank you, Sandhya. Min, do you have anything to add on this issue?
Well, I've mentioned that there can be some disagreement between the parents and children, and Sandhya already mentioned that in Asian countries it's almost very similar, and especially when children are exposed to this information first, and somehow they like to participate in the trials. But if they ask their parents their permission to participate in the trials, their reaction is completely different from when the parents first get informed and they decide that whether their children would participate or not. Even if parents think that it would be good for their children to participate in the same trial, as I mentioned, if the order of the information comes through the children first and then to the parents tend to be very negative. They question the legitimacy of the decision that their children make, so they are biased, prejudiced, I think, because they must be missing something. That's a very strange thing, if as Sandhya said, if you make the parents on your side first, anything can go much easier than through the children first. And that's a very strange thing that I think I heard from my colleagues.
So it's so interesting because generally we have a practice here that we ask the parents first, but not for that reason, for the following reason, which is that if the parents say yes, then you can ask the child. But if the parent says no, even if the child is basically 17, if you can't get them to say, I mean, with where exceptions, emancipated, and mature minors, but if you can't get the parents to agree, then you really can't ask the child or the person who doesn't have the ability to consent. And we found that when you do it the reverse, it can impose huge conflicts in the family. If the child wants to participate and the parent said no, then it's one more thing my parents said I couldn't do, kind of thing. The other thing that is, I've just been thinking about as you all have been talking is it's so interesting because we struggle in an adult population. I used to do, 10 years of pediatric oncology, but I'm an adult trained. So I have experience in both. But when in adult medicine, we have a problem with therapeutic misconception where people think that they're going to do better in a trial because it's new or whatever. And it sounds like for your child, it's the reverse.
Right.
So exactly. What do we know about, and this is a real question, about therapeutic conception or misconception for the young people? Do we know what they think? Do they think they're going to do better in a trial? Do they have any concept about this? I'm just asking, and Sheila, Sandhya, Terry, what's your sense? Don't know, right?
I'm certainly not aware of, research or evidence, in favor of one or the other. I guess it's something that we need to look into. And another, yeah, Sheila?
Well, I was just saying that sounds like a fabulous idea for a qualitative research study, actually.
I mean, here I am, like I'm like the elderly, and it just occurred to me.
I just wanted to comment on. Sorry, go ahead, Minsu.
Oh, no.
But comment on this idea just quickly about. I think culturally, historically, there's been a real deference, almost fear of challenging parental authority. And I think that comes from historically how children and parents have been framed under common law and civil law, and that is children were the property of their parents. Yeah. The parents had a sole right, even in terms of selling their child or determining their life and death. We've been moving away from that in the last 100 years or so, but it's still very much in the back of people's minds. And that idea of interfering with that authority is difficult and complex and culturally quite sensitive. But that's, I think, one of the unique dimensions of the CRC, because it kind of brings out this idea that children are individuals and parents don't have unfettered authority, but their authority is linked to the child's enjoyment of rights. And it is a long game, because it's something that we have to build over decades. This idea that parents are there as duty bearers in service of their child's rights and decisions, rather than rights holders in themselves or exercising over their authority over their child. And that's a complex idea, and it finds its roots in family law, common law, civil law, these kind of vestiges of how we view family that are interfering with these important, complex decision-making processes.
Can I ask another question, if that's okay? So one of the things that has always been challenging is, how do you determine whether a child is old enough, mature enough, and understands enough to provide assent? So, I think that's difficult, sort of, and a lot of places use an age cutoff, like the assumption is 7 or 9 or, but it seems to me that any number is so arbitrary and depends very much on the child. So how do you think about that as a policy issue? Sort of, what should we be advocating for?
Can I chime in on that?
Yeah, please go ahead, Sheila.
I think the question is often framed, how do you know when a child can assent, or what is the right age? But the question really should be, what is the function of assent? And I think that really goes to the heart of the matter, because people have so many different ideas. And as medicine and ethics have traditionally clung to the idea of determinative processes. So consent being black and white, and assent being black and white. You say yes or you say no, you dissent or you assent. But assent actually, I think, has a much different function. And we need to look at it in a different way, that it's the value of the participation and the engagement and the discussion, rather than the determinative outcome of the assent process. And the richness of that engagement process is where assent derives its meaning, rather than whether it's assent or dissent. So it's not so much what age children should be allowed to assent, but how we engage children at all ages in the discussion process on their participation in research. And I think the temptation to use words like assent and dissent derive from how we view informed consent as and consent itself as this, holy grail of participation. But in actuality, the consent process, as is mired with all sorts of uncertainties, and in itself is flawed. So the idea of getting any clear answer or relying on a singular process for that is somewhat mistaken. And I think it's more about engaging in dialogue for consent and assent with whoever the participant is through all the relationships that are around them, to be able to really get them to understand what's going on. So for me, the bigger policy question isn't so much should there be ages on assent, but should we be calling it assent, or should we be calling it something else, like the child engagement or child's participation or the child's expression of views on the research, and if the researcher has really done that, engaged with the child, meeting the child where he or she is at whatever age or experience in their life.
Great points.
Yeah, so can I just comment? So I couldn't agree less with you, Sheila. And it is very, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more with you, sorry. And what I would like to, no. What I would like to say is that it is really, really essential for you to bring it down to the level of the child, what you were exactly saying. I mean, someone who's much older, like a 19-year-old, would understand much better what you were trying to say. A 10-year-old, you have to really not scale it down, but go to their level, you know. Try to explain what is it that you want the child to do, you know, and what is the procedure. So, you know, you have to make it contextually relevant, but you also have to make it age appropriate. Otherwise, if you use the standard language, which is there in your assent form, it's not going to work. So a lot of time actually goes in getting assent from children when our field workers are out there collecting data, because you really need to go and explain to the child and break it down, you know, so you make sure that they understand what you're saying rather than just
really helpful. Unfortunately, we're going to have to close in a second, but we, you know, can't wait to continue this discussion at another time, if that's okay. We have a couple of closing slides, but before we do that, I just want to thank Sandhya, Sheila, Minsu, and Terry for this a terrific you know, discussion tonight and observation about, you know, sort of what you heard and how we should take these lessons forward in a respectful and inclusive way. So thank you so much. Let me just make a couple of comments in closing. Next slide, please. So one of the things the MRCT Center has done in this work, because we've really been appreciative of hearing how important it is to hear from the patients themselves or individuals themselves, the young people themselves, is we started looking for what information was available generally for participants, young people who were thinking about participating in a clinical trial, and found there was very little, not specifically for a given trial, but rather about your rights in a clinical trial, questions you can ask, that kind of thing. So we started developing age-appropriate materials for young people considering participating in clinical research. We now have a small suite of educational materials. For 12 to 17, of course, anybody younger can read them, but we're gonna also make them a little bit more friendly to younger folks. And importantly, all of these materials were developed by high school and young people, and then reviewed by the young people's advisory groups, both in the US, ICANN, and internationally. So this is one, Assent to Consent, which really tries to explain to people, young people who are going to the legal age of majority, what's involved and what your rights are to, at that point, assent or dissent. Could I have the next slide? So we're doing a few of these. What is clinical research? What is assent? What happens at the end of the study? And assent to consent. And we're just about finished with sharing your information, data in research. What does that mean? What happens to the data? What should you be thinking about? What is a focus group and why should I join one? Sort of really pulling together thoughts about, yes, you could join if here's what you're going to be asked. don't lie, but you also don't have to answer a question if you don't want to. And then thoughts about sensitive information in research, and what does that mean in terms of sort of sharing information that is sensitive about yourself. So if you could go to the next slide. Here you're seeing what that looks like. They're currently in mrctcenter.org/4kids, and we'll be developing this suite of materials going forward. Currently, they're just flat, i.e. brochures that you can download, but we're hopeful that we'll be making them into multimedia presentations. Could you go to the next slide? Not to ignore younger children, in collaboration with Boston Children's Hospital and the Harvard Clinical and Translational Science Center, we developed a comic book, Sophie's Science Project, What is Medical Research? And that has now been translated, as it were, to a video story. And if you go to the next slide, we've done the same for biobanking questions and answers so that kids understand what happens to their samples and their data if they are asked to give their samples. And I have to say that adults love these. So anybody who wants them, they're available for download. So could I have the next slide? The last thing I'll say is that when we were starting this work, we found that as we wanted to involve young people in, let's say, the videos or as consultants for the project or for research, we found that there was very little available to assent and consent the parents, but to think about what this means for the child and their family. And in other words, we think that just as our communications gets video consent or consents from participants, we really needed to do the same for young people in a way that was appropriate for them. So we developed a set of materials to really think about process considerations for engagement in non-research activities, i.e. not as a participant, but as a consultant or an advisor. So what is the preparation and understanding look like? The right to review the materials before and after each of the kids in the video had the chance to see themselves and appreciate whether or not they like that and would allow this to be shown. We needed to think about privacy and security considerations. There's no reason, for instance, that last names need to be used. And then how to transition before and prepare the child and then after the engagement so they don't feel used and sort of instrumentalized. And then questions offered to help stimulate the conversation and adapt to a specific context, including how do you start that conversation with the child and the parent or guardian caregiver, then thinking about how youth can contribute throughout the product life cycle, and thinking about decisions and considerations to aid those decisions. Could I have the next slide? So these are in the last stages of being developed and will be available shortly at the same website. Instructions for use, and then parent, guardian, or LAR consent, which again we advise be done before the assent, and then approaching the young persons for assent. Could I have the last slide, please? So finally, I really want to say, please use and disseminate these materials. We ask, however, that you let us know how you're doing that. But if you translate the materials, which would be delighted for you to do, please let us know that you're doing it, work with us, ensure that the translated materials remain age appropriate, because we find that many translated documents only go up in complexity. And we ask that if you take them, that we can repost them so others need not expend resources replicating that effort. Also, let us know if you have ideas for future suggestions or additional materials. We're happy to work on them and take the same process and make them and then do it with you or for you, whichever works. And finally, last slide, the webinar recording and slides will be posted in approximately a week. We are also going to post these videos on YouTube so that they can be seen and appreciated. We really look forward to hearing from you, and please sign up for future webinars. Finally, thank you so much to for the speakers, participants, and particularly those young people who shared their stories and taught us so much today. To Gigi McMillan, who produced Time to Listen, hearing from young people, to the ICANN network, producer of prioritizing young people's voices in clinical research. And they've already made 2 more videos for the next 2 sessions that will and then finally, thank you all to the youth who shared their time, experience, and stories with us. Thank you to the speakers, and thank Lisa, Jen for putting this on, and our planning committee for making this so successful. So with that, good morning, good night, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you so much for all that you've done for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Lisa.